My boss presented my 2-year campaign to the board and got a standing ovation while I watched from the back of the room, having already been told my position was being eliminated. She spent 15 months taking pieces of my work, repackaging them under her own name, and building a reputation inside that company that was constructed entirely from things I created. What she didn't know was that I had been documenting everything since month 3, that the client she was about to sign had already called me directly, and that the email she sent the night before the board presentation, the one she thought she deleted from the shared server, was sitting in a folder on my personal hard drive with 37 other emails exactly like it. My name is James. I'm 36 years old. I'm telling this story now because the last chapter of it happened 3 weeks ago and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since, and writing it out is the closest I've come to processing it in a way that doesn't consume me entirely. I need to give you some background on the industry because the specifics matter. I've spent my career in brand strategy, the part of marketing that sits upstream of advertising, the thinking that happens before any creative work begins. Who is this company in the market? What does it stand for? How does it speak to the people it needs to reach? It sounds abstract, but it's extremely concrete when you're doing it well, and when you're doing it poorly, no amount of expensive creative execution fixes the problem. Good brand strategy is largely invisible because if it's working, the brand just feels right, the way good architecture feels right. You don't notice the bones, you just feel comfortable in the building. I had been doing it for 11 years when I joined Hartwell Partners. Hartwell was a mid-sized consultancy, about 200 people, offices in 3 cities, respected in the B2B space and trying to expand into consumer work, which was where I came in. They recruited me specifically because of a campaign I'd led at my previous firm that had gotten significant industry attention, a brand repositioning for a regional financial services company that had been followed closely in the trade press and had won several awards. Hartwell wanted to do that kind of work and didn't have the internal capability, and so they hired me at a senior level to build it. My direct superior was a woman named Sandra Kay, VP of Strategy, 15 years at the firm, widely considered the most politically skilled person in the building, which in practice meant she had a sophisticated understanding of how decisions got made and by whom, and she was rarely on the wrong side of any of them. She was sharp in the meeting room, quick with the right question, good at reading a room, capable of synthesizing information from a presentation and reflecting it back to the presenter in a way that made her seem more engaged than she perhaps was. She was not, in my experience of working with her, a particularly original thinker. She was an excellent interpreter and packager of other people's original thinking. This is the thing about certain people in certain kinds of work. The skill of presenting ideas and the skill of generating them are different skills, and some people have both, and some people have one without the other, and the gap is not always visible from the outside because the performance of understanding is very close to the performance of creation. Sandra had the performance skills in exceptional quantity. She could take a strategy document I'd written and walk it into an executive meeting and make it feel like she was walking it in for the first time, discovering it along with the room, contributing to it in real time with observations that were acute and well-timed, and that subtly positioned her as the intellect behind it. I noticed this within the first few months, the way you notice a thing you can't quite name yet but that keeps snagging your attention. She would ask me for pre-reads of things I was working on, which was reasonable. She was my boss, and then in presentations she would surface the ideas as hers, or as ours, with a fluency that came from having had time to absorb and rehearse them. When I was present in those meetings, I'd sometimes add something from the document she hadn't raised yet, and she would handle it perfectly, folding it in without missing a beat, saying exactly and building on that, in a way that positioned her as the lead and me as the contributor, which was the org chart relationship technically, so it was very hard to argue with. The problem was that over time the repackaging got more aggressive. Early on it was the kind of thing you see everywhere in corporate environments, a boss who gets more credit than the individual who did the work, a dynamic so common it practically has its own genre of LinkedIn posts. I noticed it and filed it and resolved to address it at the right moment, and otherwise kept my head down and did the work because the work was what I was there to do. Then the Callaway project started, and everything changed in scale. Callaway Consumer Brands was a mid-sized packaged goods company with 6 product lines and a serious brand coherence problem. Each product line had been built or acquired separately and had its own identity, its own tone of voice, its own visual logic, and the collection of them together read less like a portfolio and more like a grab bag. They were looking for a firm to take on what they called a brand architecture project, which is the strategic work of figuring out how a parent brand and a set of sub-brands relate to each other, what each one stands for, and how they can all exist in a coherent ecosystem without canceling each other out. It was exactly the kind of work I was built for, and Hartwell brought me in to lead the pitch. Sandra was the senior partner on the pitch. This meant she was the relationship lead, the person whose name went on the proposal letter, the person who would attend the senior executive meetings. My role was to do the actual strategic work, the research, the framework, the positioning model, the presentation architecture. Her role was to provide oversight and client management. This is a legitimate division of labor in consulting. I had no problem with it in principle. In practice, what happened over the following 8 months was a masterclass in systematic appropriation. I won't walk you through every step because there were hundreds of small ones and the accumulation is what matters rather than any individual moment. What I'll tell you is the pattern. I would produce work. Sandra would review it, ask questions, make observations, some of which were useful, most of which were clarificatory, and then present it. In the presentation, she would introduce elements as her own thinking. Would say, what I've been developing when describing frameworks I'd built, would say, my approach here has been when walking through methodologies I'd spent weeks refining. When Callaway's team asked questions, she would answer them using the answers I'd given her in our prep sessions, sometimes verbatim. I documented this from month 3. Not because I had a fully formed plan, I didn't not yet, but because the documentarian instinct is one I've had my entire career, the habit of keeping records that I developed early and that has served me more times than I can count. I kept a running log in a personal document, dated entries, what I produced when, what Sandra said in what meeting, specific language she used that matched documents I'd written. I saved email threads. I saved drafts with metadata showing authorship and date. I saved the version history on shared documents that showed who had made which changes when. By the end of month 4, I had a substantial file that I was not sure what to do with. The Callaway pitch was in month 6, and it was by any objective measure the best work I had done in my career. The brand architecture framework I built was genuinely original, a model for thinking about portfolio coherence that I hadn't seen articulated in exactly that way before, that addressed a specific problem in how Callaway's products were being positioned against each other, in a way that was both analytically rigorous and practically actionable. I'm not saying this with hindsight arrogance. I knew in the making of it that it was good. I've built enough things to know the difference between competent work and work that cracks something open, and this cracked something open. Sandra walked it into the pitch with the confidence of someone presenting their best work. Callaway awarded us the project 3 weeks later. The email announcing it internally was effusive about Sandra's vision and strategic thinking. My name appeared in the 3rd paragraph as a member of the team. I went back and read that email 3 times and thought about the 8 months I'd been carrying the thing Sandra was being praised for, and I made a decision that night that I want to describe carefully because it mattered. I decided not to act on emotion. I decided to act on documentation and timing and a clear understanding of what I wanted the outcome to be. Not screaming in a meeting, not a formal HR complaint before I had everything I needed, not a conversation with Sandra that she would survive by being better at office politics than me. I decided to build the complete picture, understand the full scope of what was happening, and wait for the moment when the full picture would be most useful. This was a harder decision than it sounds. Because the emotion was there, the anger and the exhaustion and the specific bitter unfairness of watching someone else receive recognition for work that had cost you months of your life, and managing that emotion while continuing to produce work at the same level, while continuing to interact professionally with Sandra in meetings, while continuing to show up and be useful in the exact context that was exploiting me, required a kind of daily discipline that I found genuinely difficult and that I am not sure I would have been capable of for much longer than I maintained it. What kept me going was the documentation. There is something stabilizing about a record, knowing that the truth of the situation existed in a form outside my own head, that it wasn't just my perception or my frustration or my bruised professional ego, that there was a time-stamped, evidential account of what was actually happening, gave me enough solid ground to keep moving. The full scope of what I eventually discovered was larger than the immediate situation with my work. Sandra had been doing this for years. Not to everyone, she was too politically smart for that, and she needed people to be willing to work with her and for her, which meant she was selective about whose work she appropriated and when. But the pattern was consistent across multiple projects and multiple people, and when I started talking carefully to some of my colleagues about their experiences, not laying out my own situation, just asking questions, listening to how they described working with her, I started hearing versions of the same story with different details. A colleague who'd done the research and framework for a pitch 3 years earlier that had won a major award for Sandra. A junior strategist who'd asked for credit on a project and been quietly reassigned to less visible work. A former employee who'd left the company after a year and who, when I reached out via LinkedIn, responded with a willingness to talk that told me she'd been waiting for someone to ask. The former employee's name was Priya. She'd left Hartwell 2 years before I joined. We had a 45-minute phone call in which she told me, with the flat and careful precision of someone who has told a story so many times in their head that they're no longer emotional about it, just accurate. She told me about her experience, about the specific work she'd produced, about the specific credit she'd watched go elsewhere. She said, "I didn't say anything when I left because I thought no one would believe me and I needed a good reference." She said, "I should have documented it." I told her I had documented it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Good. I want to tell you about the email because the email is the thing that moved everything from the register of serious to the register of urgent." Hartwell used a shared server for project files. Team members had access to the folders for their active projects, and there was a general administration folder that was accessible to partner-level employees, but that most people below that level either didn't know existed or didn't think to look at. I had access because of my senior status, and because during the Callaway onboarding someone had given me broader access than was standard to facilitate my independence on the project. I was in the administration folder in month 11 looking for a contract template when I came across a folder I hadn't noticed before. It was labeled with an internal code that meant nothing to me. I opened it. Inside were communication archives. Emails between Sandra and the CEO and one of the other managing partners, archived there for reasons I still don't entirely understand. Whether it was a backup system or an administrative requirement or simply a habit of Sandra's, I can't say. What I can tell you is that the emails were there and they were readable, and the oldest of them went back 4 years and they told a story. The story they told was about Sandra's method, articulated explicitly in ways that the method itself never was. There were emails in which she described her approach to managing talent in language that was chilling in its explicitness, references to the importance of maintaining strategic ambiguity about contribution levels to preserve leadership positioning. There were emails in which she referenced specific people by name and their work by description in ways that made it absolutely clear she understood what she was taking and was making deliberate choices about how to do it. And there were emails in the most recent archive from the previous year that were about me. One email, dated approximately 8 months before the Callaway pitch, said, "James is producing at a very high level and the work on Callaway is genuinely excellent. My concern is about managing visibility as the project develops. He's the kind of person who clients gravitate toward, and that creates a positioning problem if it's not managed carefully from the start." Managed carefully. I read that and I sat at my desk for a long time. Because she knew. She had known from early on that what I was producing was strong, and she had made deliberate, premeditated choices to appropriate it while preventing me from developing the external relationships that would make the appropriation harder to sustain. Every restriction on my client contact, every meeting I'd been excluded from, every email chain where I was CC'd but not addressed, all of it was deliberate. All of it was managed carefully. I copied everything from that folder onto my personal drive. 3 months later, Sandra called me into her office on a Monday morning and told me that Hartwell was restructuring the strategy practice. She said the restructuring was going to collapse my current role into her own expanded remit. She said they were grateful for my contribution, that the Callaway work had been outstanding, that the firm would provide a strong reference and a reasonable severance package. She said all of this in the smooth, regretful tone of a person delivering bad news that they are not actually sorry about. I thanked her for telling me directly. I said I appreciated the clarity. I said I'd review the severance terms. She seemed slightly surprised by how composed I was. I was composed because I had been expecting this. The email about managing visibility had prepared me for it. The pattern I'd been documenting had pointed toward it. You can't build a career reputation on appropriated work indefinitely. At some point, the person whose work it is becomes a liability rather than an asset, and the logical conclusion of that is what Sandra had just done. She'd taken everything she needed from the Callaway project, established her internal standing on the back of it, and was now clearing the board before the next project began. I took the severance terms home. I reviewed them. I called an employment attorney not because I intended to sue immediately, but because I wanted to understand what the documentation I had actually gave me and what the legal landscape looked like before I decided on next steps. The attorney's assessment after reviewing what I brought her was measured but clear. What I had was substantial, it was well organized, and it documented a pattern that went beyond interpersonal workplace grievance into territory that had real legal weight. She also said something I found useful, which was that the most powerful use of the documentation was probably not in a court of law, where these cases are expensive and slow and uncertain, but in the specific social and professional contexts where Sandra's reputation was her primary asset. A court case might eventually produce damages. What I was holding could, used correctly, produce something more immediate: the destruction of the credibility Sandra had spent years constructing on other people's foundations. I signed the severance agreement, I took the check, I thanked HR, I left. 6 weeks later, I started my own consultancy. It was not a plan I had made in advance. It was what I did next when what I had been doing was taken from me. I had the work samples. I had the relationships, or some of them. I had, in a specific and ironic way, better documentation of my own capabilities than most people starting a business have, because I had 2 years of meticulous records showing exactly what I had built, at what level, in response to what brief, using what methodology. The portfolio I assembled from that documentation was, I think, the best case anyone has ever made for their own work that they didn't intend to be making at the time. The clients came slowly at first, the way they do, and then less slowly the way they also do. By month 8 of the consultancy, I was covering my basic costs. By month 14, I was profitable. By month 18, I had 3 long-term client relationships and a 4th and late-stage negotiation, and I was working more hours than I had at Hartwell, but working them in a context where the connection between my effort and my outcomes was direct and visible and entirely mine. I had not done anything yet with the documentation. This was a deliberate choice, not a passive one, not forgetting or moving on or deciding to let it go, but a deliberate ongoing decision to wait until the moment was right, which required being clear about what right meant. I had developed, over the 2 years of documenting and then the year and a half of building the consultancy, a fairly clear sense of what I wanted. Not a lawsuit, which would be slow and expensive and would require me to spend years in the weeds of a fight when I could be building. Not a public social media confrontation, which would make me look bitter and which Sandra would survive by being better at narrative management than I was willing to be. What I wanted was something that happened in the specific professional context where Sandra operated, that addressed the specific audience that her reputation was built for, and that used the truth of what I had documented in its most concentrated and undeniable form. I wanted it to happen inside a client room. And then, 14 months after I left Hartwell, Callaway called me. Not Hartwell me directly. The call came from Marcus Webb, who was Callaway's VP of Marketing and who I had met exactly twice during the original project, briefly, because Sandra had managed my client exposure very carefully, which I understood differently now. Marcus said that Callaway's relationship with Hartwell had deteriorated significantly in the 18 months since the original project. He said the work had felt different after the initial engagement. He said the strategic thinking had felt less coherent, less original, less specifically attuned to Callaway's actual situation, and that when he and his team had tried to have deeper conversations about the methodology behind the work, the conversations had felt thin. He said there was something different about the original work. The architecture framework, the way it was built, the way it was explained, that thinking hasn't shown up in anything since. I let him finish. Then I said, I built that framework. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I know, I looked it up after we started having problems. The version history on the documents shows the author metadata. Your name is all over it. I said, He said, I'd like to know if you'd be interested in talking about working with us directly. This was the moment I had been waiting for without knowing exactly what form it would take. Not a lawsuit, not a confrontation. The client coming back to the source, the market correcting for the misrepresentation in the most direct possible way. I told Marcus I was interested. I told him I had some things I wanted to share with him before we went any further, things that would give him important context about the work and about the situation at Hartwell, and that I wanted to share them in person rather than over the phone. He said he could meet me in 2 weeks. I said 2 weeks worked. In the meantime, I called Priya. I told her where things stood. She said she'd been watching Hartwell's client roster quietly for the past 2 years and had noticed what I'd noticed, that the quality of the strategic work coming out of the firm had declined significantly, that there were whispers in the industry about a gap between the firm's pitch performance and its delivery performance, and that 2 clients had left quietly in the previous year. She said she'd like to be part of whatever happened next. I said I'd be in touch. I also called the employment attorney, not to file anything, to ask a specific question about what I could and couldn't share with a prospective client about a former employer's conduct when that conduct was directly relevant to work the prospective client had commissioned and paid for. The attorney's answer was, in summary, share facts, not opinions, and let the facts speak. I had a great deal of facts. The meeting with Marcus was on a Tuesday morning at Callaway's offices. I had prepared a presentation, not a pitch for my services, not yet, that would come later, but a clean, factual documentation of the Callaway brand architecture work, showing the origination and development of the strategic framework in granular detail. Version histories, email metadata, draft evolution. The documentation I had kept for 2 years, organized and presented clearly. Marcus looked through it in silence for about 20 minutes while I sat across from him. When he looked up, he said, "How long did you know she was doing this?" I said, "Since month 3 of the project." He said, "Why didn't you say something at the time?" I said, "To whom? She was my boss." The CEO was CC'd on the emails supporting her approach. I didn't have the external relationships to go directly to the client because those were managed carefully to prevent exactly that. He looked at something in the documentation. He said, "There's an email here where she describes managing your visibility." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you have this from the company's own server." I said, "I had access at the time. I took nothing I didn't have authorization to view." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I need to make some calls." I said I understood. He said, "Give me a week." I gave him a week. During that week, I did not contact Sandra or Hartwell or anyone else connected to the situation. I went about my work. I ran 3 client calls. I revised a strategy document for one of my existing clients. I went for my morning runs. I did not sleep particularly well, but I slept. On Thursday of that week, Marcus called. He said, "I've been talking to some people." He didn't specify who. He said, "There's going to be a conversation at Hartwell's board level about the client work. I'm not the only one who's been noticing the gap between what was sold and what was delivered." He said, "This is going to move faster than you might expect." I said I was available, however it was useful to be available. He said, "I'd like you to be present for a meeting next week, not as a Hartwell employee, obviously, as the person who built the original work, as context." I said I would be there. He said, "One more thing." He paused. He said, "Is there anyone else at Hartwell whose work was treated the way yours was, someone who might be willing to speak?" I thought about Priya. I thought about the junior strategist who'd been reassigned. I thought about the folder on Sandra's server that went back 4 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "It would be helpful to hear from them." That meeting is in 4 days. I have spent the past 3 days preparing for it with the same systematic thoroughness I bring to all work that matters, which is all work, which is everything I've done since I understood what was being taken from me. I have a presentation that is factual and complete. I have documentation covering 2 years of a pattern that has affected multiple people and multiple clients. I have Priya, who has agreed to participate by video call. I have the email archive from Sandra's server, legal to share under the attorney's guidance and devastating in its specificity. And I have something else, something that came to me 2 days ago in an email from a name I didn't immediately recognize, that I've now read a dozen times and am still deciding what to make of. The name was Kevin Ashworth. I had to look him up. He's a managing partner at Hartwell, not in Sandra's reporting line, not someone I'd had much interaction with during my time there. His email was brief. It said he'd been made aware of some questions arising around the Callaway account and the origination of the work. It said he had some information that he believed was relevant to the upcoming meeting, and that he'd like to speak with me before it happened. He said he'd been watching Sandra's pattern for 3 years. He said he had his own documentation. He said, "I should have done something about this earlier. I want to be useful now." I have a call with him tomorrow morning. I don't know what he has. I don't know whether this is someone who genuinely wants to do the right thing, belatedly, or someone who is protecting themselves from a situation that is about to become public regardless of their participation. I don't know if what he has changes the shape of the meeting or complicates it or simply adds to a picture that is already clear. What I know is that on Monday I'm going to walk into a room with the people who commissioned the most important work of my career, carrying 2 years of evidence, and I'm going to let the documentation do what I built it to do. Sandra has spent years in that company building a reputation on a foundation she didn't construct. On Monday, someone is going to look at the actual foundation. I'll update after the meeting. If it goes the way the past 2 years of careful, patient, documented preparation suggests it should go, I'll have a lot to say. If it doesn't, I'll have learned something important about the gap between what is true and what is believed, And I'll write that down too because I write everything down. That much Sandra taught me at least. Everything worth protecting is worth documenting. And I have been documenting for a very long time.